You are about to meet the sweetest, most irresistible little girl you've ever known. 8-year-old Charlie McGee. She's everything a proud father like Andy McGee could want, and all that he can fear. For Charlie was born with the most destructive power a human being has ever commanded. And somehow she must be saved from both herself and from those in high places who want to use her as their weapon. Meet Charlie and see what happens when innocence and beauty ignite with evil and terror. Firestarter.
In a special and startling way, King has created a small American gem of a story.
The most tightly plotted of King's killers, this is also the most terrifying, for evil here is human and wholly credible, his finest novel yet.
Stephen King is superb. He has written Carrie, The Shining, Salem's Lot, and The Dead Zone, among other bestsellers. This is his highest Fahrenheit reading yet.
It's good to be king. Today's book is a great spark in which to light the fire, the warm hearth that is the King's Corner. We call it the Firestarter. Okay, I can't keep up that accent the entire review, so... Firestarter is a book published by Stephen King on September 29th, 1980. Its general reception, as far as I could find, was good. It's got a 3.9 on Goodreads, it's got a 4.7 on Amazon, and it's got a 4.1 in Barnes & Noble. It was also a New York Times bestseller, as far as I could find. Now, there's some decent trivia behind it. It was actually already adapted into a movie once, in 1984, where Drew Barrymore plays the young Charlie McGee, David Keith plays Andy McGee, and Martin Sheen plays Cat. A TV movie sequel titled Firestarter Rekindled was made in 2002, where Margaret Monroe played a grown-up Charlie McGee, and Malcolm McDowell played John Rainbird. Not sure the casting choice behind having Malcolm McDowell play a 7-foot-tall half Cherokee, but... And as of when this video is meant to be published, a 2022 adaptation is going to be released on the 13th of May, which, if it's anything like this book, go see the adaptation. It'll probably be good. This book was also nominated for Best Novel for the British Fantasy Award, the Locust Pole Award, and the Balrog Award. So, yeah, there's a lot of hype behind this book. There's a lot of potential build-up. And let's see if it lives up to the tale. So, we're going to start where we always do. We're going to start with the cover. The front cover is pretty good. As you can see, it's a mostly black background with two haunted little eyes staring at you as a fire builds in front of them. In the fire, you can sort of make out the lips and the nose of a face forming in them. Now, this is really effective. The eyes have a decent haunted quality to them that really sells the inner turmoil that Charlie McGee goes through throughout the book. And the fire in the front, it's pretty good. You can also kind of see where the tag I tore the cover, so yeah, I'm not happy about that one. However, being a book published in 1980 and being a King book, which means it's been in circulation almost the entire time probably, there's several covers of this that I could talk about. I went online, but forgive me if I haven't seen them all. Now, however, I will put this up. This right here, that's my favorite cover that I find. This right here is probably the laziest. Now, I chose this one mostly because... Okay, I chose the good one. I just like it. I guess I don't really have a big analysis why I like the one I like. But with the bad one, I can at least explain because it's a personal issue. The bad one, I just don't like when adaptation material overtake stuff on the front page. I've seen it with Percy Jackson. I actually didn't complete my I didn't complete my Percy Jackson series for years because for a while all I could find was the Sea of Monsters book that had the movie poster as the cover, not a cover more pertained to the book. And I'm not going to go on a long rant about that. Maybe another day. So, the back is simple. It contrasts the front by being more of a silver color, while basically having just the synopsis and a whole bunch of quotes from reviews to really hype it up. So it does its job somewhat effectively, even if I would argue it's a little bland. The contrast to the front is nice, and it does more than just tell you what the book's about by building a little bit of hype. So, starting off with that, we'll go on. I'll include my link to the end where I give a general final thoughts about the book, in case anyone who wants to pick it up wants to do that without spoilers. I recommend doing so. I personally loved reading this book. I guess that's a bit of a spoiler myself, but I liked reading this book, and I recommend you pick it up too, especially in light of the new adaptation coming out. So, here's the link. Now on with the review. So, one of the things that King does for me is he creates his own little sections in the book. Each part of the book is divided into small sections, typically around the area that they're currently in. So, I'm just going to use King's sectioning rather than my own. I'll have to combine a few because some are only like 10 or 15 pages long, and I don't want to just... This section is this. Okay, there you go. Moving on. So, yeah. So if there's more than normal, that's why. I'm not gonna have comments on every single section. 1 or 2 sections is mostly just gonna be a quick recap of the events that happens in it. But I will try to give my basic thoughts on what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it on each one. So, we start with the first one. New York, Albany. This is pages 1 through 59. Now, this is where we get our introduction to Andy and Charlie McGee. Now, the book actually starts with a quote from Fahrenheit 451. It was a pleasure to burn. This is the first line of Fahrenheit 451. And honestly, it's pretty decent at summing up the book. It's sort of like a guilty pleasure for Murtagh as well, but same for Charlie. This is where we're introduced to Andy and Charlie McGee. Andy is Charlie's father, and the two of them have been on the run from a mysterious government group known only as the Shop. And we don't learn much about him in this first section. The tone, though, is set very early and well, as Charlie and Andy basically try to stealthily flee through New York from a pair of Shop employees that are currently chasing them. Neither side is trying to draw attention to themselves, but it eventually culminates when Andy has to leap into a cab and demonstrate his psychic powers by making a cabbie think that a $1 bill that he hands him is a $500 bill. That way he'll take him all the way to Albany. They go to Albany from there, where Andy McGee gets this splitting headache. It's described as so bad that if Charlie wasn't there, he might kill himself just to get out of the pain of the headache. So as he's kind of starting to pass out at an airport that they stopped at, Andy has to rely on Charlie to go get them some money. There's some clear hints here that she doesn't like using her powers, but Andy has to tell her it's an emergency. I know you don't like it, but it needs to be done right now. And so she goes and she basically robs a group of payphones, because this is the 1980s, you see. And gets a whole bunch of coins and quarters and stuff. Now, this is one thing I gotta compliment Stephen King, because we this is where we get our showcase of how powerful Charlie is compared to her father. While her father has a massive splitting headache that literally makes him want to kill himself just from pushing a cabbie to believe what he's saying, and from some mild stuff earlier on, Charlie is able to basically psychically punch all of these payphones and then light a guy on fire without even really breaking a sweat. Lighting the guy on fire even happened on accident. And I'll give Stephen King this compliment. He knows how to make you hate a character in the first paragraph you meet him.
Eddie Delgado sat in a hard plastic contour chair, looking up at the ceiling and smoking. B, he was thinking. She'll think twice about keeping her goddamn legs closed next time. Eddie this, and Eddie that, and Eddie, I never want to see you again, and Eddie, how can you be so cruel? But he had changed her mind about the old, I never want to see you again bit. And when she came back, Sally would be like a big ripe apple herself, ripe and ready to fall. None of that don't you have any respect for me stuff went down with Eddie Delgado of Marathon, Florida. Sally Bradford was going to put out, and if she really believed that crap about him having had a vasectomy, it served her right.
So yeah, you don't really feel bad for the guy who gets lit on fire, but it's a decent showcase of Charlie's powers and how out of control they are as well. This guy was just annoying her because she could sense that he wasn't being genuine. And so she accidentally lights him on fire. It's just, yeah, God help when this girl gets into puberty, right? So, from here, Andy starts to sort of flash back to how this happened. He thinks about how he signed up for this research project in college, where he met his future wife, but more it focuses on the Lot 6 experiments by a Dr. Wanless? I'm going to go with Wanless because there's no E in his name. Dr. Wanless, who injected them all with a chemical compound known as Lot 6. Now, during this time, they were super loopy. I actually give props here to Stephen King during this section because he changes the style of how he's writing to sort of sell what the characters feel like under drugs, and it's done really well in my opinion.
Several of the grad students were running in slow-mo towards one of the cots that had been placed near Room 70's blackboard. The young fellow on the cot appeared to be doing something to his eyes, because his fingers were hooked into them, and he seemed to be clawing his eyeballs out of his head. His hands were hooked into claws, and blood was gushing from his eyes. It was gushing in slow-mo. The needle flapped from his arm in slow-mo. Wanless was running in slow-mo. The eyes of the kid on the cot now lay deflated like poached eggs, Andy noted clinically. Yes, indeedy.
So basically during this, Andy remembers a whole bunch of stuff happening, but after the drugs wear off, they basically just tell him, well, no, none of that actually happened. It was a pretty powerful hallucinogen, right? His wife remembers some of this stuff happening, and some of the stuff he doesn't remember, but in the end, she doesn't want to delve deeper. They're just dating right now. Anyways, so after we get some reference to the past, we go back to Charlie and Andy as they leave the airport just before the shop finds them again, and are able to hitch a ride with a kind of a hippie guy. He takes them all the way to Hastings Glen, where they shack up in a cheap motel, while Andy just immediately passes out. This is also where we meet some of the shop's agents. Now, these guys are mostly background characters. They're used to sell certain emotions of scenes, but aren't really meant to be anything else. And you have Norville Bates, Glenn Cook, I think that's one of the guys here, and OJ, the Juice. I don't know if the OJ reference here aged well or not at all. But I'll leave that up to you guys because I can't decide, especially with some of the stuff that happens later on. But yeah. Next, we get to Longmont, Virginia, the shop. Now this section is a shorter one. It only goes from 60 to 85. This is where we're introduced to Captain Hollister, who runs the shop. And we basically see his efforts to get Andy and Charlie. We meet again Dr. Wainless, who has really fallen in the years due to having a stroke a few years back, and has become obsessed with killing both Charlie and Andy, whereas the shop just wants to capture them to make use of their psychic powers. See, he believes that Charlie and Andy are very dangerous, and that eventually they might cause the end of the world with their powers. But I do have a complaint here. Pages 76 to 79 are all dedicated to a singular point. And it just... Dr. Wainless goes on forever to reach the conclusion of that point. Basically, the more they push Charlie to use her powers, the more it's like cracking a dam. Eventually, the dam is going to crack and the water's just going to flood out, destroying everything in its path indiscriminately. I guess this probably wouldn't have been as bad if it wasn't also pointless, but I guess more on that later. Instead, I'm mostly just going to complain that it takes forever. It's a slog to read through this part after the first 2 pages, and you still have another page to go, and it's all just the same point. It could have been done better, especially when we get to page 87 to 89, where that point is made much faster and much more clearly by Charlie, an 8-year-old girl. So yeah, I know it was probably meant to be like that due to the characterization of Dr. Wanless. Maybe I'll just call him Wainless. That's how I've been referring to him. Anyways, this point, it might just be that Dr. Wainless keeps going on, but it's a drag to read, even if it is his character. This is also where we meet John Rainbird. Now, John Rainbird is a almost 7-foot tall, half Cherokee hitman for the shop. He's called in and talks a bit with Cap. We don't get much about him in this particular section, but we do learn that he unnerves pretty much everyone he meets. Even Cap doesn't like him. He basically says something about Rainbird just is wrong. It seems like he doesn't even disturb the air in front of him when he walks forward. And you know that slight sense you get when you're not alone in a room? For some reason, Rainbow does not trigger that when he enters a room. So he could be like standing behind you for a good 10 minutes before you realize you're not alone. Anyways, we get to the next section. The incident at the Manders farm. Now, this follows about where Charlie and Andy wake up at Hastings Glen. Charlie wakes up first, and this is why I have to really compliment King, at least in this book. Every single character in this book just oozes with personality. But in this particular instance, Charlie's guilt and inner turmoil at her powers and what they can do is just sold really well. This little section here.
I wonder how they'd like it if I set them on fire, a part of her asked coolly, and she squeezed her eyes shut in guilty horror. It was nasty to think that way. It was bad. Charlie reached out and grasped the hot shower faucet and shut it off with a sudden hard twist of her wrist. For the next 2 minutes, she stood shivering, clutching her slight body underneath the ice-cold needling spray, wanting to get out, but not allowing herself to. When you had bad thoughts, you had to pay for them.
It just, you can just feel how much guilt and turmoil she has. Now, between this, we get little interludes of the shop agents in Hastings Glen looking for them. We meet with OJ and his team again, and OJ almost breaks the arm of a waitress who calls him ugly. again, either aged perfectly or not at all. Charlie and Andy just barely avoid the shop agents who are about to get to the hotel to search for them when they have a blowout just down the road from where they are. This is also where we kind of get hints that both Andy and Charlie have precog abilities. It's not perfect into the future kind of sight, but they get real bad feelings whenever a shop agent is close. So they know that's about time when they need to head out. With this, they head out just before those shop agents get there. They only manage to escape because the shop agent's tire explodes, and basically one guy comes up the hill to the motel to ask them, right, as Charlie and Andy go down the hotel. Charlie and Andy are picked up hitchhiking on the side of the road by a nice farmer named Irv Manders, who, while taking them out, invites them over for lunch. He takes Charlie and Andy back to his farm, where they meet his wife Norma, and the two of them talk a bit. Irv points out that he knows that something's wrong with Andy and Charlie. He's not dumb, but he figures that the agents in town must be looking for them because they're strangers, and despite Andy's cover story, nothing he has about him is adding up. He doesn't have overnight bags. Charlie fumbled a lie, and basically that. See, he figured that Andy stole Charlie because he couldn't win custody of her in a divorce. But Andy, it doesn't quite explain why, but it's not really dwelled upon too much. Andy decides to trust him with the full truth. He tells him that the shop basically is hunting them because they both have psychic powers. Now, Andy kind of thinks he's crazy, but this is proven true when the shop managed to track him down to the farm. Now, the shop pulls out full force. At this point, they've decided that they just want Charlie alive. They're perfectly willing to kill Andy because he could just get in the way. Now, Andy tells Charlie that she's going to have to use her powers to get them out of this because there's no way they're going to escape normally. Charlie's apprehensive, but she seems to get this look in her eyes as she goes out. This distant look filled with rage. See, it's sort of hinted throughout the novel that both Andy and Charlie have the ability to sense emotions. It's more clearly stated for Andy, as he was able to know the name and some of the past sins of a guy during his Lot 6 experiment. Charlie is more subtle. We never quite get from her perspective when she realizes something about someone, other than her hinting that she just knows when someone's lying. But it's very much implied that she has the same power as her father. She can sense things about people, and that comes into question later, though. Anyways, she figures out that they plan to kill her dad, and this sets her off. After Irv gets in the way of them about to shoot a hole in Andy's head and gets shot himself, she unleashes her powers to the full extent. She blows up cars, she pops chickens with spontaneous combustion. The guy in charge is reduced to nothing but a pile of ash because she's angry at him. She sets some agent's hair on fire. And it's just like chaos. Agents are fleeing. We see OJ fleeing into the fields. And this is actually where I'm going to bring up a complaint here about OJ. See, as amusing as the reference is, especially in light of today, because this was written 14 years before that scandal, but OJ is a completely pointless character. You could completely cut him from the book, and nothing would change. And ordinarily I wouldn't say that because there's a bunch of characters in here you could say that for. But in this particular case, he receives a lot more attention than the rest of them. And there's even what I thought was going to be a Chekhov's gun set up with him. See, while he's running away, he has this big magnum gun that he calls the Windsucker. And he drops it after falling into a hole and twisting his ankle. Specific attention is brought to the fact that he drops it and doesn't realize it and keeps running on his sprained ankle. So I thought this was going to be, as Andy was leaving, he was going to run across the gun and pick it up just in case. since he can't use his powers as frequently as Charlie without burning himself out. But no, OJ recovers it later after the chaos, and he's just back to being a background character. So anyways, yeah. So he's a pointless character for as much time as he gets. So anyways, after all this, Irv, despite being shot, still very much understands that Charlie is not a bad person, even if his wife briefly gives in to the fear that she has and calls Charlie a monster. Now, Irv wants to help them, so he gives them his old truck and tells them how to get past the roadblocks that the state police have set up around the town. They decide to go to Tashmore, Vermont, where Andy has a cabin that he inherited from his grandfather. This is where we get into the next section. This is the first of the two combined sections that I'm going to bring up, which is Washington, D.C. and Tashmore, Vermont. It takes place between pages 130 and 184. We get some more background in this chapter about Andy and Charlie. Specifically, when Andy's wife was murdered and Charlie was briefly kidnapped by the shop, which set them on the run. See, Charlie was at work one day and just got a real bad feeling that he should go home as soon as possible. So he goes home quick to find that Vicky has been tortured and killed by the shop agents, and that Charlie has been kidnapped from her friends where she was staying the night. He quickly hunts them down, and using his psychic powers, convinces one guy he's gone blind, and gives the other guy narcolepsy, basically, by saying, "You're gonna go to sleep." It's revealed later that anytime someone even says sleep around him, he passes out for like a day. And the two take off. Now, honestly, I know this was written in the 1980s, but I read this next line and it just made me laugh a little more than it should have been. Yeah, don't you wish that was still true today, right? This section, though, the flashback of that part ends really well, selling Charlie and Andy's sadness as they both when they finally stop their running and break down about the loss of Vicky, the wife and the mother.
It's going to be all right, he told her, not really believing it, knowing as every adult knows in his secret heart that nothing is ever really all right. It's going to be all right. He was crying. He couldn't help it now. His tears came in a flood, and he held her to his chest as tightly as he could. Charlie, I swear to you, somehow, it's going to be all right.
Of them. It's just sadness. Now, after this, the Washington, D.C. part is about John Raybird, who's been contracted by Cap to hunt down and kill Dr. Wainless. I'm just going to call him Wainless. I don't know why I keep debating this. Dr. Wainless, because he's becoming too much of an issue. Cap doesn't want to listen to him complain about how they need to kill Andy and Charlie all the time. So Wainbird kills Dr. Wainless, but not before sitting down and talking to him about Charlie McGee. And this sets up his infatuation with Charlie. I'm going to get into more of this later, but it gets really uncomfortable, but in a way that King intends. So it's a compliment, but it's a fair warning. I'll put up a trigger warning about what I'm going to talk about when I get there. So, yeah. We also, in this section, learn about Charlie and Andy in Vermont. They basically managed to hide out the whole winter there. They're able to stay hidden in the cabin, have a somewhat decent time resting up, and Charlie makes a vow that she will never use her fire powers again. She just did not like the chaos she caused. She hated hurting people. And if I have a brief complaint here, is that there's a failed bit of foreshadowing. One little chapter ends with the line,
God loves to make a man break a vow.
And it's just unfortunate because after this, we're given 2 points of vows. One, Charlie saying she'll never use her fire powers again. And while that does break later, the other one, Andy talking about how he swears never to pick up a gun and use it, is never broken either. So it comes off like failed foreshadowing. Not in the sense that she's saying here, and Andy never breaks it. So yeah, it's just. This section eventually ends with Andy deciding, since winter is ending, they need to move on. But before they move on, he's finally decided that he's going to go to the major newspapers and tell their story, hopefully to get the shop to back off, because they can't run for the rest of their life. Now, we get to the next section, Cap and Rainbird and In the Box. This is another short section, 185 to 206. Now, this starts with Captain Hollister giving Rainbird the mission to go get Charlie and Andy. Now, at this point, he's fully aware of Rainbird's infatuation with Charlie. Rainbird wants to get a hold of Charlie and get close to her before eventually killing her. You see, Rainbird has become something of a death seeker over the course of his life. And not just that he seeks death for himself, which he does do, but he tries to see the meaning in death for other people. He watches people as they die because he wants to know what goes through their mind in those last minutes. He wants a hint of what's going to happen. When he killed Dr. Wainless, he sat there and watched his eyes as he died. And he's always been disappointed because despite what the stories have told him, how people get that slight sense of enlightenment or calm, every person he's killed just has a look of confusion on their face right before they go. So it's just been very unsatisfying for him. And he figures Charlie, as a child and one with extraordinary powers, may give him some insight no one else is going to get. So it's kind of sick, but that's still not where it gets bad. So Captain gives him a go-ahead, but under the conditions that Rainbird said that if he does this, he has permission to try to get close to Charlie and eventually kill her when they no longer need her. This is another slight complaint I had. We find out that the shop had found Andy shortly after they arrived in Tashmore, Vermont. But they don't try to move on him until he tries to send out the letters. And it doesn't make any sense from a logical perspective. They clearly want him, and they plan on capturing him again now that they think they can use him to manipulate Charlie. But they could have moved in on him at any time. They know that with his powers comes a cooldown period, and they don't know that for sure for Charlie, but they think that's true. So they could have moved in on him and Charlie at this time, but they chose not to until he tried to send out those letters. 4 months after he arrived in Vermont. Okay. There's actually a small little section here where King refers to, I think, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he has some of the country people talk about how there's this Russian writer in Vermont who just stays in his cabin all the time and writes. And it's just, I thought that was a neat little detail, especially since it caused me to go look the guy up. At this point, they finally move in on Charlie and Andy as they're about to leave. Rainbird is able to quickly trank Charlie by getting her a shot in the neck, while Andy is taken out after he's not quite sure it's a trank and is freaking out over her limp body. So they're both captured and taken to the box. This is basically where we do a quick time skip a few months ahead of time again, and it's revealed what's happened of them. You see, Charlie is refusing to cooperate. She's a tough nut to crack, so to speak. She's difficult, she doesn't talk to anyone, and she refuses to do any testing. John Rainbird has sort of inserted himself into her life as a janitor, in the sort. He goes in and cleans her room as just that constant force there. Andy has was purposely hooked on Thorazine, which is keeping him completely compliant, and he's basically a mind-addled drug addict. He's just getting fat and lazy, and he's kind of just spacing out most of the time. For some reason, it seems like he doesn't have power anymore, and no one can figure out why. So yeah, basically Cap and Rainbird, and in the box. So we cut to the next part, the blackout. Now, there's not much to say about this one. The blackout is it's going to mostly be a recap. It basically details a small blackout that takes out all the shop's powers and sets the groundwork for the later chapters. Now, the two sections are Andy's and Charlie's. The blackout manages to convince Andy to completely get over his drug addiction. He gets his powers back and is able to subconsciously push himself to no longer depend upon the Thorazine to get by in the day. And this all happens because he gets a deep sense of dread about Charlie and has a dream where she's becoming friends with this one-eyed pirate, which is John Rainbird, who had his eye ripped out by a claymore. On Charlie's side, this is where John Rainbird finally managed to get her to start trusting him. It's a little more dark. See, when the lights go out, he pretends to be terrified of the dark and starts freaking out while he's cleaning a room. Charlie, being a sympathetic little girl, tries to talk to him and keep him calm as he pretends to freak out. This is mostly told from John Rainbird's point of view, and it's uncomfortable with just how much joy he takes with fooling and wrapping this little girl around his finger. But he's basically able to wiggle his way into her good graces with this. So, with that, that's basically what the blackout is. So, we get to the next one. Small Fires, Big Brother, which is pages 257 to 302. So, we get some more points of view from Andy as he takes in his cell and stuff. But this is also where we get more and more about John Rainbird as a villain. And this is where I'm going to put my trigger warning. So, for those of you who have, I guess for lack of a better word, are triggered by the following subject, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, that are triggered by the following subject, skip ahead to this time when I'm done talking about it. But, trigger warning, I'm going to talk about child grooming. Now, John Rainbird is, it's startlingly, what he does with Charlie is so uncomfortably close to how child grooming is that it can be very uncomfortable at times. And don't get me wrong, that's a good thing. John Rainbird clearly isn't a good guy. He's meant to be seen in the wrong here. And it's uncomfortable with how he does it. Especially when he talks about how much he loves Charlie. He talks about how he wanted to know her in an intimate way. Now, to specify, he makes sure to clarify this isn't an intimate in the biblical sense, but more like super close friends. And he's getting in her good graces. He pretends to be her friend. He's purposely inserting himself as a paternal figure. He's making sure they share secrets to deepen that bond. It's just, and there's this undercurrent this entire time that he's just using this because he plans to use Charlie later for his own personal enjoyment. Whether that be the normal reason for child grooming, or for his case, where he just plans to kill her when she trusts him the most. It's very uncomfortable. He claims to see her as a person, but it's very clear he just objectifies her as much as the shop people do. He just sees himself as better than that. So, and I'm not saying this idly.
A couple of points. First, you've both got to get used to the idea that she's simply not going to light fires for you ad infinitum. She's a human being, a little girl who wants her father. She's not a lab rat. Ramadan had said once that safes were like women. Given the tools and the time, any could be opened. There were, he said, tough cracks and easy cracks, but no impossible cracks. This girl was tough. He felt his chisel slip farther under the corner of the box that was Charlie McGee, and he involuntarily squeezed her hand again. 3 days later, the fish swallowed the lure.
So yeah, it's just, it's very uncomfortable. But it's done very well, and it makes you very much dislike Rainbow. However, during this time, there is one small complaint I had. I'm not sure, it's more of a nitpicky complaint, I will acknowledge that. But for as committed as Rainbird is to the bit, he makes constant little slip-ups that convince me that he's only doing this so well because it's with a child. Now, he acknowledges that fooling a child is much easier than an adult. But for me, it's a bit paradoxical that on one hand, he purposely comes to work, the orderly outfit, parks what all the other orderlies do, and demands that anyone who knows where he is treats him as nothing more than a low-rung janitor, even when Charlie can't see them. Is that committed to the bit? But also makes small mistakes, like saying the word conflagration in one sentence and then pretending not to know what pyrokinesis is in the next. Or how to say it. How to say pyrokinesis in the next. It just, to me, it comes off a little bit paradoxical. You get one image of John Rainbird being super into his part, and the other image where he is making constant little slip-ups like that. So anyways, we get to this section is where Rainbird is able to convince Charlie to start doing tests in exchange for little favors from the scientists. He tells her she can eventually build these favors up to flat out seeing her dad. But he knows she'll never get that. He knows that when that time comes, she'll no longer be useful for them, and that's when he gets to kill her. And so that's basically what this is. It's just that slow build up as she gets to it. That's when we get to the next section. The end game, which is 303 to 342, which is ironically not the last, not even the second to last section. I like that this is basically where Andy is able to set up and carry out his plan to rescue Charlie. To basically keep him in the facility longer while he thinks it out, and then he's able to get close to Cap Hollister and is able to mentally dominate him without anyone noticing. Now, he uses Cap Hollister to arrange to get him out by pretending they're sending him to another location, and is able to get a message to Charlie telling her not to trust Rainbird, and that he plans to get them out when next time she goes to see horses that they have on site to sell the uncovered nature of the facility. And I do ultimately like that the ultimate wrench in the works for them ends up being Andy's paternal instincts winning out over his own addiction and his own mental blocks. And the shop's downfall is ultimately because they underestimated him. It's this nice little thing that completes the theme of how of the paternal instinct that is brought up a lot with Andy, and how parents will do whatever it takes to save their children, even if their children might be more powerful than them. He managed to set all this up. However, Rainbird is able to figure out what's going on when people start realizing that Cap is acting real weird. You see, one of the downsides of Andy's powers is if he doesn't use it carefully, it can cause a ricochet effect, where a small, seemingly unconnected incident in someone's life or a small little trigger word can cause them to shell up about some kind of trauma they've hidden, and it just keeps building and building and building until they eventually kill themselves due to it or break down. The first guy he used it on, it ended up being revealed that he was a cross-dresser who got hazed about it a lot in college to a sexual degree, and maybe a closet homosexual. He may even be a closet transsexual, but I'm not sure. This was written in 1980, so my conclusion is he was probably just a cross-dresser who was gay. So after this guy has a breakdown, starts cross-dressing again, and has a embarrassing sexual moment about that, ends up shoving his hand in a garbage disposal and ripping it to pieces, which killed himself. And Cap seems to be hyper-focusing on snakes and golf. It's revealed later that his older brother was killed by a snake, and the only reason he wasn't killed by the same snake is because the snake put all of his poison in his brother, and he feels extremely guilty about that. But the reason Rainbird finds out is he realizes this, and he goes to plug it into the computer. Now, this is a small complaint I have. The computer is this thing that has been brought up multiple times throughout the story. It's mostly just a background thing. They figured out where they were going to go because they plugged in the probability of what's going to happen in the computer, and they figure it out. So ultimately, it's kind of one of those, you think it's just them using technology, but this computer is so accurate with its guesses and predictions that it almost comes off like it's a supercomputer at times. It comes off like it's its own little feat of magic, and that just sort of raises questions because it's brought up enough that you can't just hand wave it, and it's outright responsible for the worst moments of the hero in the story. But it's still just treated like an everyday thing, and maybe it's just me not being super familiar with 1980s technology, but it doesn't. I don't think that just punching in a few numbers in a 1980s computer would be able to accurately calculate the probable chance of Andy having regained his powers and used them on people. So, yeah. But anyways, Rainbird figures out what's going on and sabotages their plans a little. He plans to meet Charlie at the stables before Andy can get there and kill her. Now, this is where we go to the next section. Firestarter and Charlie Alone, which is 343 to 401, the end of the book. Now, there's not much to say. Charlie gets to the stables to wait for her dad. She manages to get the guard to go away, but Rainbird is already there waiting for her. He purposely locks all the gates to the horse stables because he thinks Andy won't start a fire if it means she might kill them. And then he starts to taunt her from the roof, basically messing with her head. Now, he plans to kill her, but he wants, like I said, he just wants to mess with her head a little bit. So eventually he's doing that, and as he starts to get Charlie to come up to him, Andy busts in just in time to save her. Now, Rainbow tries to use Andy as a bargaining chip to get Charlie to start coming back up. But Andy is able to basically keep Charlie from obeying long enough that Cap, his ricochet in full effect, snaps. And he picks up a rake and starts beating a garden hose with it because he thinks it's a snake coming at Andy, who he's starting to see as his older brother. Now, this causes Rainbird's instincts as an assassin to snap in before his thoughts, and he turns to shoot Cap, thinking he's an assailant. This gives Andy just enough time to look at Rainbird, and with all the force he can muster, tells him to jump from the second story where he's hiding onto his leg Brong. Now, Rainbird can't help but obey, but Rainbird is able to hold on to his gun the entire time and land, and after he lands with a sickening crunch, his leg breaking, he shoots and he kills him. Now, this sets Charlie off. She releases this pressure wave that's described like a cannon. It blows the barn to pieces with such force that shop agents who are starting to converge are torn apart just from the rubble flying out. One guy is ripped in half, another guy is decapitated, another guy loses his ear but doesn't even realize it because it happened so fast. And Charlie, sharing her last words with her dad tells her to get out no matter the cost. Now, a good little moment here is Charlie does listen to him. She goes out, and anyone who shoots at her or tries to stop her, she lights on fire like that, or just blasts them away with that pressure wave. But she pointedly tells herself she's not going to hurt anyone who doesn't do that. She's still managing to keep to her morals even when in this great sense of grief. Which is sort of why I said that earlier when the dam bursts thing was sort of pointless. It's foreshadowing that Charlie is going to lose it and just kill everyone. But in the end, even when she's pushed to the breaking point, she still holds on to her morals. And I really like that. I do really like that. Especially for an 8-year-old. So anyways, she manages to escape the shop. And the next section is mostly her by herself. She somehow makes it back to the Manders farm, where Irv and Norma take care of her and get her up to healthy again, before the shop is able to find her again. However, the day before they show up, Charlie decides, after overhearing Norma and Irv contemplate how they're going to handle this, because it's starting to get around town that they've adopted some young strange girl off the street, which is ultimately what led the shop to her, and they know that the shop will eventually find her. She decides that she's going to leave them for their own safety, and she's going to go to New York to do what her dad tried to do, tell their story. The story ends with her going into the Rolling Stone magazine and her looking to the person escorting her, and
Charlie smiled. It was the smile that had so dazzled the librarian. "Yes," she said. "I've been waiting a long time."
So yeah, this book is pretty good, actually. I know I've heard that Stephen King has a lot of misses and hits. It's sort of like a roulette wheel with him. You either gonna get something real good, real bad, or real boring. And admittedly, despite my kingly collection here, I haven't personally read too many of his books. Partially because, I mean, hell, man, look at the size of some of these things. Fucking, hey, look. Where's my... Yeah, look at this. Look at this. Look how big this is. I like to read my books in a week time, so if I do ever end up doing The Stand, or 11/23/69, or Under the Dome, or just any of these massive ones I got, I'm probably going to end up reading it alongside something else and doing that. But, yeah. But, for a starter Stephen King book, this is pretty good. It's a nice, self-contained story, though I've heard it appears in The Dark Tower later. Don't quote me on that. That's kind of one of those through the grapevine things. It's basically this nice story about parent trying to protect his daughter from the great forces of the world that he can't stop, but tossing some psychic powers into the mix. It's just that nice little story. And I would highly recommend it, even as a first book, to anyone looking for a good Stephen King book. I would personally place it at an 8 out of 10. It's a great Stephen King book. It really shows off his talent for writing, especially in the character department. But it's not perfect. There's a couple things here and there that you'll ultimately scratch your head at or say, that doesn't make much sense. And King, unfortunately, has a habit of lingering too long on specific things that don't ultimately make too much of an impact on the overall story. The Wayne List talk, OJ, all that. So, it's a good book, but it's not I'm not sure if I'd call it perfect. I would heavily recommend reading it, though. And if the newest adaptation is anything like it, I would recommend doing that, too. So, this has been our Frodo Reviews in the Kingly Corner. And remember, folks, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth taking, even if it's a bad one. Ho ho!